Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar about China Medical Devices 101. Jackie and I just have done a bit of a re-record of a session we ran the other week to ensure a smooth reception of all of the points, and we'll run through those in around 40 minutes. Here's an agenda about what we're going to talk about. I'm Hamish, I'm CEO at our company Cisema, and I'm joined by my colleague Jackie. Jackie, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Jackie Lee, and I'm currently the lead at Cisema to support medtech companies with China, GPA, and Hong Kong approval projects.
So, as mentioned, we're going to run through a number of points here to help refresh those who know already, but also introduce to those who don't, with an understanding of the broader regulatory strategies and framework for global regs about the China framework for medical devices. We're going to talk about the framework before we dive into some recent registration trends. We'll step into the pathways, classification, and other key points around submission before some detail around type testing, clinical evaluation and pathways, timelines, and all those fun points with a case study to finish. So without further ado, the China regulatory system for medical devices is framed by the top level law of Order 739. That is although I said law, actually it's a level below a law. It's more a regulatory order issued by the State Council, as compared with drugs, which is administered with a top level law, and we'll talk about the draft proposed shortly that will elevate medical device regulation to be equivalent to drugs. Below the Order 739 are various administrative measures and others all issued by the relevant authorities. State Council is really the key authority in China, below which sits the State Administration of Market Regulation. That's the top level body below which the NMPA, or National Medical Products Administration, sits. NMPA is the key body that reviews dossiers, that has approval authorities for new registrations, and also various issuing and other responsibilities for post-market matters. NMPA issues circulars and other directives, and then there are of course standards and guidances, both recommended and mandatory for different software or other specific products, as well as in accordance with global regs, similar China-specific standards and guidelines that are often equivalent to the international equivalents, but not always. And as we'll talk about, you need to be quite aware about the specific China points and China slight gaps that are important as part of your product registration submissions. So I flagged just before that there is a new draft law proposed. It's also be helpful to remind about some of the background that China is a relatively new or recent developer as far as medical device regulation is compared with other markets. Only 25 years or so ago, the medical devices were officially regulated, and that was with Order 206 by the State Council. It wasn't until 2014 when medical device regulation, and in particular pre-market submissions, became much more strict and regulated, and there's been an acceleration since of a vastly increasing and mature regulatory framework for regulation in China. Most recently, Order 739, as mentioned, was issued in 2021. However, a new top-level law was issued in draft, and we've included some links here on the slide, which you're welcome to access at your leisure. and a copy of the slides will be sent out. In a bit more detail about that new law, here on the slide, you can see some of the top points. This was issued in a draft for comment, actually towards the end of last year. However, it has not yet been enforced, and it's now expected only towards the end of 2026 or even 2027 at this time. Why? Well, there are a number of changes that are substantial and that have some benefits, in particular for imported products. The first of which, as you can see here on the slide, relates to a removal of the requirement for a country of origin certificate, which is required to support an imported product approval, and that will greatly improve imported market access on a parallel global rollout approval pathway, because currently you need to get your approvals in home country before you can go to China, with some minor exceptions, which we can talk about. Some other changes worth mentioning are increased reliance on real-world data in support of a clinical evaluation to confirm safety and efficacy. There's other interesting points relating to registration certificate transfers that encourages the easier transfer between imported to locally manufactured. There's more responsibilities on the domestic responsible agent or legal agent, and this is the authorized representative in China that is required for imported products to make their submissions to NMPA and represent the manufacturer before the authorities. There's also an increased emphasis on total life cycle review with a co-vigilance system, requirements, and increased reporting. And finally, innovation is a key term, and there's various emphases on innovative products and encouraging innovative products to come to the China market. So now some trends. Jackie, would you like to take us through these things?
In 2024, the NMPA granted a total of 13,133 approvals covering domestic class 3, as well as imported medical devices and in vitro diagnostics IVDs. These approvals can be categorized into three main types: 3,363 initial registrations, representing approximately 26% of the total, 4,722 registration renewals accounting for 36%, and 5,048 changes in licensing items, comprising the remaining 38%. In terms of product classification, medical devices represented the majority with 9,695 approvals, or about 74%, while IVDs account for 3,438 approvals, or roughly 26%. This distribution highlights a mature and stable regulatory environment where a substantial proportion of activity is focused on renewals and post-approval modifications, and an indication of sustained compliance efforts and ongoing product lifecycle management within China's medical technology sector. And on the next slide, you will see a table outlining the trend in applications, which is represented in blue, and registrations in yellow since 2018. The data shows a continuous increase reflecting the growing demand and activity in the Chinese medtech sector. On the next slide, from 2020 to 2024, the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea consistently ranked as the top 4 countries registering medical devices and IVDs within the NMPA, reflecting their continued market dominance. France has shown steady growth, rising from 7th in 2020 to 5th place in recent years. In contrast, Switzerland and Italy have seen gradual declines. Emerging markets are also becoming more visible, such as Ireland, that entered the top 10 in 2023, and Australia appeared for the first time in 2024. Israel has maintained a stable position throughout the period. Overall, the trend indicates a mature but diversifying registration landscape with increasing participation beyond traditional US, European, and Japanese manufacturers. And on the next slide, we have an overview of the different pathways to obtain approval for medical devices in China. The standard route, which starts on the left, is the typical NMPA registration. The NMPA based in Beijing is China's primary healthcare products regulator. Standard registration for overseas devices must already have approval in their home countries, such as the CE mark for the EU or FDA 510K for the US. Clinical evaluation reports or trial data are also required. We will dive deeper into these requirements, processes, and timelines in the next slides. There are also fast-track approval pathways that can expedite market entry. These include priority review, emergency approval, and conditional approval. A notable example in the innovative medical device pathway, which encourages technological advancement and R&D, this route is particularly interesting for global regulatory strategies because home country approval may not be required. However, a China patent is essential.
Yeah, and just I'll jump in there as well, Jackie, because this green channel is of course of interest, and to supplement my earlier points around needing home country approval, this is an example where you don't need home country approval if you get an innovative designation. However, it requires an additional application to NMPA before you make your submission. So that itself can add to timeline and sometimes not entirely complement the reduced review timelines, which you will otherwise get for green channel access. Also, as far as we're aware, the only international companies to obtain green channel by an innovative designation so far are the multinationals Medtronic and Intuitive Surgical. The other companies, at least at this time, are Chinese medical device manufacturers. Nevertheless, discussing with some of the Intuitive regulatory folks, they do say, look, this is accessible for other companies too, in their view, and so yeah, it's certainly a pathway available if you have the relevant China patent. For the other alternatives, we have Hong Kong Integrated Bay Area, and Jackie's going to talk a little bit more detail about that shortly, and Hainan Boao-Lecheng, which is a medical tourism zone off the south coast of China, China's Hawaii. Jackie, about Hong Kong.
Yep. So Hong Kong currently regulates medical devices and IVDs under a voluntary listing system. However, this framework is becoming increasingly significant as listing is now required for participation in public hospitals, tenders, and sales. With the planned establishment of the CMPR, the so-called Center for Medical Products Regulation, and the introduction of a primary evaluation mechanism that was announced since the 2023 policy address, the latest updates from the Hong Kong Authority indicates that mandatory registration requirements are expected to be announced in 2026, with actual implementation dates to be confirmed. The current voluntary framework excludes low-risk products, specifically Class 1 medical devices and Class A IVDs. Listing applications generally require prior approvals from major regulatory authorities such as the US FDA, NMPA, MFDS, etc., and have a minimum processing time of approximately 12 weeks with a 5-year validity period. Applicants must also appoint a locally registered business entity or a designated local responsible person to act on their behalf. Beyond regulatory compliance, obtaining Hong Kong listing offers strategic advantages, including access to Greater Bay Area pilot initiatives and the potential to generate real-world data supporting future mainland China registration. On the next slide, here is a comparison of the market potential. So Hong Kong's population is slightly smaller than Switzerland's, while the GBA's population rivals that of Germany or Turkey. As of September 2025, there are 14,278 pharmaceuticals and 7,991 medical devices actively listed as approved by the Hong Kong authorities for sales. Among these Hong Kong approved products, 120 products have been reviewed and approved by the Guangdong NMPA, considering meeting the conditions to sell directly to a designated list of 45 hospitals currently available in the Greater Bay Area.
So here we just show Hainan, which is the other alternative pathway worth mentioning. Hainan, as mentioned, is China's Hawaii, and it's a tropical island off the south coast of China mainland. The Hainan pilot zone is itself a 10 by 10 kilometer square zone that is dedicated to catering for wealthy Chinese who travel for their elective or other medical requirements. And so those patients want to access the latest medicines and devices, and there's this specifically dedicated zone set up, which allows for products that are not registered by NMPA but registered elsewhere in the world to get approval within a matter of weeks or months to sell into the 20 or more hospitals now that have been built. You can see here on the slide actually a photo that I took of the exhibition hall just a couple of months ago when I was there in Hainan. On the left-hand side of the picture is what this town looked like in 2015, 10 years ago. It was just a dirt track with a small village, and on the right-hand side is the same picture from the same location now, where there a gleaming new hospital buildings have been built, all within a short period of time. And yeah, these hospitals are able to cater to and do wealthy Chinese, as mentioned, and sometimes in a hybrid type system of Western medicine as well as the latest Chinese medicines. The challenges so far are getting sufficient patients, or because people travel to these hospitals from all over China to this small zone. So especially for follow-ups, if that's required for certain surgeries or operations, that can be difficult when people are traveling there and back. Yeah. So Hainan is an interesting option, especially for gathering real-world data, where you may not have sufficient clinical data on Chinese ethnic population already, and there is a specific NMPA real-world data center on the island in this tourism zone. So to shift gears now to talk about classification in a little bit more detail, because your risk classification will really determine what clinical pathways are open to you. Classification is structured similarly to US, with a class 1, 2, and 3, 3 being the highest risk, and is broadly equivalent to other markets, except that it is often more conservative. So you may well be up-classified in China as compared with the risk class you are familiar with. There is a specific classification catalog which is updated every year or two, or sometimes more often, and it's list-based, so it has different types of products with pictures and descriptions and so on, and you can find your product description in there. Then it's clear what your risk class is. If not, there are specific rules or guidances, but when that occurs, it's usually a better idea to apply for official classification to NMPA, which can take a number of months. The practical challenge with such classification requests is NMPA tends to ask more and more information, which can be challenging from a manufacturer perspective for timelines, because there's no clear end date or no clear guidance on when that final determination will be issued. What about software products? Software are regulated under the same framework of medical device. There are some rapidly evolving frameworks in China for software as medical device, as well as AI-driven software as medical devices. However, the frameworks are still more conservative and not as mature as other markets. In particular, clinical requirements are still quite strong, and the authorities will often want to see clinical studies run on Chinese ethnic population within China in order to support your submissions. The positive news is that such clinical studies are relatively inexpensive as compared with other types of studies and can be done in a matter of months. So that's something to be aware about with respect to your standalone software when you're considering classification. Combination products is another hot topic in China as around the world, and that means those products that have some aspects of device and some aspects of drug, of course. And the NMPA definitions will be familiar to those of you from other jurisdictions. Really, the primary function of the product, if it's physical or mechanical, then it will be a device-led combination product, whereas if it's pharmacological or so on, then it will be a drug-led combination product. One other point to mention in brief as we finish talking about classification is that as compared with Europe, where class 2 to class 3 is a very substantial jump, and in US, in China, the bigger class jump is from 1 to 2. Class 1 products will undergo a filing process, whereas class 2 and 3 will both undergo a registration process. And so, and also the evidentiary burden or requirements are somewhat similar. Class 3 having a higher burden, of course, to demonstrate safety and efficacy. But customers sometimes hear, if their product will be up classified in China, that it's class 3, no way, we can't handle a class 3 product. Just because it's class 3, that does not mean automatically you must have clinical studies done in China, and it's certainly in broad terms similar to a class 2 classification, subject, of course, to the usual provisos. And here's what a class 1 filing process looks like. It's and Jackie, maybe you can take us through it, but it's a relatively short process as compared with a class 2 and class 3.
So before reviewing the recent updates, it's also useful to recap the registration process for Class 1 medical devices in China. Class 1 products are considered low risk and therefore follow a document-based filing process with no local testing required. The process involves preparing the registration documents and the product technical requirements, the PDR, which is appended to the certificate once issued. Notarization of documents and embassy authentication are needed. Submission in person to the NMPA counter, usually by a legal agent acting on the applicant's behalf. If the submission meets all the formal requirements, the filing certificate is typically issued on the spot. In our experience, the overall timeline from document preparation to receipt of the certificate is around 2 to 4 months, with the in-person submission handled efficiently by our experts in a single day. Once issued, the Class 1 filing certificate is valid indefinitely, minimizing ongoing maintenance obligations. This streamlined process makes Class 1 devices relatively simple to register compared with higher risk class categories. And
yep. Well, and here's what that higher risk categorization looks like in timeline. We say 18 months for a class 2 and 21 months for a class 3. With the NMPA legal agent, your local rep being the one who needs to make the submission. The first step, however, is a PTR or product technical requirements drafting process. That's the first bulleted point on the screen. And that takes broadly 1 month, and it's an iterative process. That PTR itself will go through various changes over the life of the dossier submission. The PTR sets out the technical specifications along which performance tests will then be conducted after transporting samples. So the type tests are tests done in China, China certified test lab, according to China standards for your product. And these type tests can be a practical pain point because test labs may not be familiar with your product. They may ask questions which will delay and put you to the back of the queue. And this process, if it goes on and on, can drag your testing for a very long time. So it's a key point to be asking your consultant or your local team Are we ready to respond in short time to the test lab? Do we have people on site, from our representative or otherwise? And this is what we do for our customers. We have test engineers on site in the lab who can respond immediately in order to keep the project moving forward. The CER is the other key document that needs to be drafted as part of the dossier submission. And it's not simply a translation of your European CER. It really needs to be written in accordance with the China standards for your particular product. And that takes quite some efforts. And we broadly estimate 4 months for drafting that in parallel with the testing. So the dossier is ready to submit to the NMPA. And then after a 60-day review time for class 2 and 90-day for class 3, a supplementary notice is issued. That supplementary notice sets out various additional questions that NMPA wants to get comfortable about. And you have 1 year within which to respond to that supplementary notice. Generally, we would seek to respond, of course, as soon as we can, whilst making sure we give a fulsome response to satisfy the reviewer. You also have some opportunities for some informal feedbacks before that final response is submitted, whereafter there will be a second evaluation by NMPA and a final administrative approval and certificate issuance. So let's talk about some of the clinical pathways and requirements for your class 2 or 3 product. We have a framework here where we break the analysis into 5 questions. The first being, is the product high risk? Because if it is, then it's highly likely to need clinical trial data in China on China ethnic population, even if it's a bridging study in order to satisfy the authorities as part of your submission. Or is the product on an exemption list? Then it's clear. You don't need to do clinical trials in China. And we've shown here on the right-hand side of the slide that there are exemption lists that are updated occasionally with over 1,000 products across class 2 and class 3 as well that are specifically exempted from clinical trials, and no clinical study data is required. Otherwise, do you have clinical study? This is question 3. Do you have clinical studies already done elsewhere in Europe and US? As long as those studies are done in accordance with GCP, clinical practices, then it should be sufficient for China NMPA, and you can write a clinical evaluation report based on that overseas clinical data. There can be some gaps. For example, the authorities may also want to see what that clinical data looks like on Chinese ethnic population, but such gaps can, in our experience, often be done on the papers as well, on literature or other supporting documentation, but it's a case-by-case basis. Question 4 or 5 are really focused on the kind of 510K equivalent for China, which is the predicate device pathway. However, I would say that it's a harder pathway in China because you don't have the same level of competitor or predicate data available, because that predicate must be a China registered product, and there isn't the same disclosure required as part of the submission publicly. So especially for non-active products, those where manufacturing process or the like is generally required for your predicate, if that's a competitor product, that information will be very difficult to get. We still have experience writing CERs in all these difficult cases. So if you would like to know more about that clinical pathway, please let us know. Jackie, do you want to take us through the cost briefly?
Yep. So the cost for registering medical devices in China vary by risk class. For class 1 devices, the process is a simple filing with no registration fee. So a ballpark figure of the class 1 devices is 10 to 15,000 US dollars and taking 2 to 4 months. For class 2 devices, registration is required and there's an application fee of about 30,000 US dollars. So the ballpark for class 2 increases to about 100 to 120,000 US dollars to additional fees for applications, testing, and translation. For Class 3 devices, registration involves an application fee of $42,000. The total cost is approximately $150,000, reflecting the complexity and extensive testing required. Costs may vary based on specific requirements. And appointing an NMPA legal agent is a mandatory step when registering a medical device in China. Manufacturers can choose between several approaches. Using a distributor allows them to cover initial costs, manage communications with the NMPA, and handle post-market activities. But sharing documents and intellectual property may limit flexibility if the relationship changes. Establishing a subsidiary office provides full control over registration and compliance, but it requires significant investment in hiring experienced personnel locally. Third, engaging an independent consultant offers regulatory expertise, manages customs issues, and retains certification documents, often at a lower cost than setting up an office. In all the cases, the manufacturer retains ownership of the registration certificate, while the legal agent serves as an official point of contact with the NMPA.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. And just to supplement, IP risks really for the distributor pathway are something to consider. And yes, there are many distributor relationships which work very positively. This is, however, a risk for IP leakage because you need to provide very detailed documentation as part of your registration process. That documentation needs to be submitted by the NMPA legal agent. If that NMPA legal agent is your distributor, that's in our experience where such IP leakages can occur. Your own subsidiary pathway, as mentioned, is a more expensive approach. Service provider is a middle ground, and we act in this role for many customers. And that legal agent also has ongoing responsibilities, which are increasing as NMPA takes a more of a life cycle approach review of products in the market. The legal agent needs to be on top of adverse events and managements and recalls, and annual reporting requirements, and a general post-market compliance system. UDIs are now required, so there are continual changes even for ongoing or in-market products, and these controls are important to maintain and be aware about. As part of your certificate management, you'll also need to consider whether product changes are required, because an approval change where there's a major change can take 12 months or more. So that's something that really needs to be planned in advance, and that's where drafting the PTR is important, because if there's a change in the PTR, this will usually trigger an approval change. Renewals as well. There's a 5-year expiry for Class 2 and 3 products. You need to submit your renewal at least 6 months before expiry in order to maintain the certificate currency. Yeah, the other thing to say about post-market is NMPA is doing more and more inspections and audits, surprise audits, where NMPA will take a product being sold on the market, send it to a test lab, and check the results of the testing versus the product technical requirements. And for legacy products that were approved 10 years ago or more, this can be particularly problematic because the regulations, as mentioned, weren't as mature then. Those approvals, and particularly the PTR, may not have been drafted appropriately or are no longer relevant for the current product, which has had some changes that haven't been managed as well as they could. Even where there's no safety issues in the market, the product's been sold for 10 years, and NMPA is pulling companies, international and domestic manufacturers. They are pulling those companies up and saying there's a mismatch here, there's gaps that need to be resolved, or else the company will need to withdraw the product from the market. So it's very important, even for legacy products that have been in the market for a long time, to check closely and manage the certificate, the PTR, to ensure that you can continue to sell and access the market without issues. So we're finally going to talk about a brief case study or two. The The first relates to a German Class 3 dental implants manufacturer, which had various models across 5 series, and it had clinical trial exemption, but detailed parameters of the dental powder and biocompatibility were required. We helped the customer to prepare the relevant detailed documentation and literatures, which were sufficient before the NMPA to satisfy the authorities and obtain registration. Biocompatibility for dental, as with other products, can be a key concern, and NMPA often views biocompatibility requirements more strictly than other authorities and will require increased evidence as compared with other authorities. So, although biocompatibility reports are the one type of test report that can be accepted from overseas labs, provided they are GLP compliant, please encourage you to check about your biocompatibility reports to see if they are sufficient to be accepted by NMPA and if they are wide enough to cover NMPA requirements. We were able to successfully support the customer in this case to obtain the approvals. And the second case is a Class 3 product in wound care area that was not exempt from clinical trials and only had a competitor predicate on the market. We were able to progress and convince the NMPA that additional testing alone was sufficient, and there was no need to perform a clinical trial in China, as would otherwise be required. This, of course, saved the customer substantial time and money as compared with a full clinical trial in China or even a gap study in China. So this is another successful example of where even high-risk products don't necessarily need overseas clinical trial data or even China clinical trial data in order to obtain approvals, provided a robust clinical evaluation report, some creative thinking around additional testing or other documentation that can support the final submission. So that's the end of our session, and yes, we can support with many aspects of China approvals as well as elsewhere in Asia Pacific. I won't go into detail now. The key takeaway really is that China approvals are realistic and achievable, and we're helping companies obtain such medical device registrations every day, as well as in Hong Kong, as well as in Southeast Asia. The regulatory and feasibility discussions, thinking about that appropriate pathway, thinking about your clinical requirements, your testing requirements, how that looks as compared with drafting the PTR to set out the appropriate specifications are important. Generally, many companies will default to relying on their distributor for regulatory approvals, but we strongly encourage you not to do that for China market and to try to separate the two and stay objective and think long term. It is an 18-month to 21-month process, but it is realistic and achievable. If you have any additional questions, please, of course, don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.